The IV line had run dry 3 hours ago, and nobody had come to replace it. Sergeant First Class Marcus Devlin had been staring at the empty bag long enough to memorize every crease in the clear plastic. It swayed slightly from the sealing hook. They called it a sealing, though it was really a stretched membrane of something the Voth used to seal wounds in their ships, semi-translucent and faintly bioluminescent in the dark. Everything on this station smelled like the inside of a greenhouse left to rot, sweet and wet and slightly wrong. He was the only human on level 9. He knew that because the Voth medical staff moved differently around him than they moved around each other. Around each other they were quick, almost careless, their four-fingered hands working IV lines and bioscanners with a kind of bored efficiency. Around him they slowed, not with gentleness, with the particular caution of someone reaching past a dog they weren't certain about. He couldn't blame them. He'd been unconscious when they'd brought him in. He knew that from the after-action report that Specialist Ochoa had managed to push through the translation relay before she'd been evacuated to a different ward. The report said Devlin had been pulled from the collapse site at Grid 7, Echo, after 47 minutes under rubble. It said his left side had sustained injuries consistent with a detonation at close range. It said, with the clinical flatness of military language, that extraction had required the assistance of 2 Voth combat medics, who had initially assessed him as non-viable. He had a vague memory of one of them leaning over him in the dark beneath the collapsed wall. He remembered the smell first, that greenhouse rot smell, which he now understood was how the Voth always smelled. It was just their biology, and then the faint glow of a scanning device passing slowly over his chest. He remembered hearing something that the translation implant in his jaw rendered, poorly, as, "The wound does not allow continued function." He'd grabbed the scanner out of their hand. Not aggressively, he barely had the grip strength. But he'd held it and he'd looked at them. There were 2 of them. He could see that much through the dust and the dark, 2 pairs of pale gold eyes, and he'd said, in a voice that came out rougher than he intended because there was concrete dust in his throat, "Give me a minute." And then he'd passed out again. That was 3 days ago. He knew it was 3 days because he'd been counting the shifts. The Voth didn't use day-night lighting cycles the way humans did. They used color-temperature shifts in the membrane sealing, cooler and bluer for work cycles, warmer and amber for rest. He'd counted 6 transitions. 3 days. In 3 days, no one had said anything comprehensible to him. The translation implant caught words but not full sentences. He got fragments. Insufficient, the outer layer, consistent with prior assessments. Once very clearly something that the implant rendered as, "They usually don't." He didn't ask them to clarify that one. The nurse, he thought of her as a nurse, though he wasn't certain the Voth had an equivalent concept, came on the 4th morning. He knew she was different from the others because she entered without the slowing down. She walked to his bed at the same speed she would have walked anywhere, checked the empty IV bag with one glance, and then looked at him with the particular Voth expression he'd been trying to decode for 4 days and hadn't cracked yet. The Voth didn't have eyebrows. Their emotional signaling was in the neck. A series of small bioluminescent nodes ran along both sides of the throat, and they pulsed in patterns that the xenobiology briefing said corresponded to emotional state, but the briefings had been written by people who'd studied the Voth from a distance. Up close, Devlin had found, the nodes were much harder to read. There were too many of them, and the patterns were too fast. This one's nodes were doing something he hadn't seen before. A long, slow pulse from the base of her throat up toward her jaw, then nothing, then again. She was looking at his left side. He looked down at it too. The Voth had dressed the wound in their own materials, something like compressed moss, held in place by strips of the same membrane material as the sealing. It had done something. The pain had moved from a constant scream to a constant dull roar, which was progress. But under the dressing, he knew what was there. He'd gotten a look at it on day 2 when one of the other staff had changed the packing. There was a lot of damage. bone and tissue damage that he had enough medical training to identify as serious and enough survival training to not think too hard about. The nurse said something. The implant gave him, "You are the one they," and then a gap, and then, "Grid 7. "Yeah," he said, "that's me." She said something else. This time the implant gave him more, "This type of wound, in the VOTH, no one." He watched the slow pulse move up her throat again. "No one survives it," he said. The nodes froze. It was the first time he'd seen them do that. All of them, all at once, simply stop. She stared at him with those pale gold eyes for a long moment, and he could see the moment she understood that his translation implant had caught enough for him to understand what she'd said. Then something happened in her expression that he couldn't name, the VOTH equivalent of being caught, of recalibration. "I'm going to need a new IV bag," he said. "The other one ran out about 3 hours ago." She looked at the empty bag. She looked back at him. The nodes were doing something fast and complicated now that he couldn't begin to parse. "And some water," he added. "Hot if you have it. I know that probably sounds, I know your biology is different. But human physiology does better with warm fluids when recovering from trauma. It's not preference, it's actually physiological. If you check your xenomedical database, you'll probably find it." She hadn't moved. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, which he intended as reassurance and realized halfway through might have come out wrong, given the context. "I mean, I intend to recover. I'm going to need the IV bag." She left. Not quickly. Not with the slowing down caution of the others. She left at the same speed she'd entered, and she was back in less than 4 minutes with a new IV bag and a container of something warm that turned out, when he cautiously tasted it, to be approximately the right temperature and not actively hostile to his digestive system, which he counted as a win. She hung the new bag and connected the line without speaking. He watched her hands. 4 fingers, slightly longer in proportion than human hands, with the same kind of unconscious competence you saw in any medical professional who'd done the work long enough to stop thinking about the individual steps. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him again. "Marcus Devlin," he said, and pointed at himself. He'd had this conversation with enough non-English speakers in his career to know the muscle memory of it. "Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army, attached to the 14th Joint Expeditionary Force." He paused. "I know the Expeditionary Force part probably sounds alarming given everything, but I want to be clear that the 14th is a diplomatic support unit. We were in the transit hub when the collapse happened. We weren't doing anything aggressive. We were waiting for a connecting transport." She said something. The implant caught. The collapse at Grid 7 was not caused by, and then a word it couldn't render, which meant it was either a proper noun or a technical term. "Then, we know this." "Okay," he said. "Good, that's good." She looked at his wound again. "How bad is it?" he asked. A pause, the slow node pulse up her throat once. "I've seen worse," he said. "Not on myself, but I've seen worse survive." She said something that the implant rendered only as a single word. "How?" It took him a moment to understand that she was asking genuinely, not rhetorically. Not as a diagnostic question about his species' biology. She was asking the way someone asks when they've seen something they can't account for and they want to understand it. He thought about how to answer that. "Stubbornness," he said finally, "mostly." Her nodes did the fast, complicated thing again. "I know that's not a medical answer," he said, "and I'm not saying my biology doesn't matter, it does. Humans are we're more resilient than we look in some ways. We evolved under conditions that required a lot of redundancy. Our cardiovascular system has backup mechanisms. Our pain response is calibrated differently than a lot of species. We can compartmentalize it in a way that lets us keep functioning when by rights we shouldn't be." He paused. "But mostly it's stubbornness. We decide we're not done yet, and then we're not done yet." She was listening. He could tell because she hadn't moved, and she'd had the IV bag connected for about 2 minutes now and had no medical reason to still be standing there. "My unit," he said and stopped. He hadn't talked about his unit since he'd been awake. Do you know if they were recovered?" 14 personnel. Ochoa, she was evacuated to a different level, I know that, but the others. She said something. The implant caught, 7 were recovered viable, 3 were, and then a gap. Then, the remaining 4 are still being searched for. 7 viable, 3 he didn't want to think about, 4 still out there. The 4, he said, in the rubble. They need. We are aware the implant caught. The search is ongoing. He made himself lie back. He tried to sit up further to hear better, and his left side had reminded him immediately that this was a bad idea. "Okay," he said, "okay." She was still there. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, because it seemed like she was waiting for something and he had nothing else to give. "When I was under the rubble, before your medics found me, I was conscious for about 12 minutes at the beginning, before I passed out the first time." He looked at the ceiling membrane, the way it moved faintly with whatever passed for ventilation on this level. "I could hear things settling. You know that sound? When a collapse is still moving, still finding its new equilibrium. Things grinding together. And I knew, I had enough structural awareness to know that if it shifted again, certain things would happen to me that would be non-survivable." He paused. "I started singing," he said. "I know that sounds insane. My mother sang to me when I was sick as a kid, this specific song. I don't even know where it's from, she never told me, just this song. And I was lying there in the dark with the concrete settling around me and I started singing it because it was the only thing I could think of to do, and I don't know. I kept my breathing even. I kept my blood pressure from spiking. I kept myself calm enough to not make the situation worse." He exhaled slowly. "I found out later that your medics heard me singing before they found me. That's how they located me." The vibration carried through the debris. He looked at her. "I don't know if that's a medical explanation," he said, "but you asked how." She was very still. Her nodes were doing the slow pulse again, but it had changed. It was slower now, more deliberate. And it wasn't just moving up toward her jaw, it was moving down toward her chest as well, both directions at once, which wasn't something he'd seen before and which the xenobiology briefings certainly hadn't covered. She said something. The implant caught more this time, more clearly than it had caught anything yet. Maybe because she was speaking slowly, maybe because she was making an effort. "I have been a medical worker for 11 cycles. I have treated Voth warriors with this wound configuration. I have treated Gennari with this wound configuration. I have treated Solon and Drevathi and the pale ones of the outer belt." A pause. "In 11 cycles, I have never seen viable function beyond the first rotation." "And I'm on day 4, he said. "You are on day 4, the implant confirmed her words. "Day 5 tomorrow," he said. A long pause. Then carefully, she said something that the implant rendered with surprising clarity. "What do humans do when they should not be alive?" Marcus Devlin thought about that. He thought about Corporal Enriquez, who had taken shrapnel to the throat in Sector 7 of the Gennari incursion, and had kept directing fire for 6 minutes before he went down. He thought about Lieutenant Park, who had walked on a broken ankle for 11 hours across the Calvary Plateau, because the medevac couldn't land and someone had to get the wounded out. He thought about Specialist Tours, 22 years old, who had held a pressure bandage in place with both hands for 4 hours on a transport with no medical supplies, because she decided that the man she was holding it against was not going to die on her watch. He thought about himself, 12 minutes in the dark, singing a song whose origin he didn't know. "We get annoyed about it," he said, "and then we keep going." Her nodes did the fast, complicated thing. "I know that's not satisfying," he said. "I know you want a biological answer. I'll tell you what I know about human wound response physiology if you want. I have basic combat medical training. I know some of it. The redundancy in our vascular system, the way our inflammatory response can be suppressed by adrenaline load in a survival situation. There's real biology there. He paused. But if you're asking what the actual deciding factor is, it's that we get annoyed at the idea of not making it, and that annoyance turns out to be load-bearing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up a scanner and ran it over his left side, slowly and methodically, the way she might have run it over someone she expected to recover. Not a diagnostic scan. He'd had enough diagnostic scans in the past 4 days to recognize the difference. This was a treatment planning scan, the kind you did when you were mapping out what to fix next. "Thank you," he said again. She didn't answer, but she stayed. On day 6, she brought someone with her. He was taller than she was, which Devlin had noticed was unusual. The Voth didn't seem to vary widely in height, and most of the staff on level 9 ran about a head shorter than him. This one was nearly his height, with the node lines running up both sides of his neck and continuing faintly along the line of his jaw. Older, Devlin thought, though he had no framework for aging in the Voth. Something about stillness. The way someone carries themselves when they've been carrying themselves for a very long time. The nurse, he'd started thinking of her as Neris, which wasn't her name. It was just the sound the implant gave him when other staff addressed her, and he wasn't certain it was even her name versus a title, introduced them. The implant caught. "This is," and then a proper noun it couldn't render followed by, "He is the senior medical authority for this station." The senior medical authority looked at Devlin's chart. He looked at the wound. He looked at Neris. He said something the implant caught most of. "You called me here because a human is on day 6. Neris said something the implant didn't catch. The senior authority looked at Devlin. 6 days, Devlin said before the man could say anything. "I know. Neris told me what the baseline outcome is. I'm aware that I'm outside the standard distribution." The senior authority said something. The implant rendered it as, "Are you in pain?" "Yes," Devlin said. "Consistent pain in the left lateral region, sharper when I try to breathe deeply. But it's been decreasing at a consistent rate. 3 days ago it was about 8 on a 10-point scale. Today it's about a 5. Silence. "Your colleague mentioned that Voth with this wound configuration don't survive past the first rotation. I've been thinking about why that might be physiologically different in humans, and I have a theory. I don't know enough about Voth vascular anatomy to be certain, but..." He stopped. "Am I allowed to ask about your vascular anatomy? I don't want to overstep some kind of cultural boundary." Neris's nodes did the fast, complicated thing. The senior authority turned to look at her, then back at Devlin. He said something that the implant rendered slowly, with several gaps. "In 11 cycles of medical practice, she has never called me here because she believed a patient would recover." "She called you here because she thinks I'll recover," Devlin said. The senior authority looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down. There was a low structure near the bed that served as a seat, and the senior authority lowered himself onto it with the deliberateness of someone setting down something heavy. He folded his four-fingered hands together. "Tell me," the implant caught him say, quite clearly, "about the singing." So Devlin told him. He told him about the 12 minutes in the dark. He told him about the song. He told him about the theory he developed lying in this bed for 6 days with not much else to do. The theory that the act of controlled vocal production under stress forced a regulation of the respiratory system that in turn moderated the cardiovascular stress response. That it was not magic. It was biomechanics. You couldn't sing and panic breathe at the same time, and your body knew which one was in charge. He told him about combat breathing, which was a technique in human military training that did the same thing through deliberate slow inhalation and exhalation, and how singing was a naturalized version of that process, and how his mother had probably never known she was teaching him a survival technique every time she sat by his bed when he was sick and sang that song whose origin he still didn't know. The senior authority listened. His nodes, Devlin noticed, were not doing the complicated thing or the slow pulse. They were doing something he hadn't seen before, a faint, nearly imperceptible shimmer, all of them at once, like bioluminescent water in low light. I don't know if any of that is medically useful to you, Devlin said when he was done. Your patient's physiology is different enough that the specific mechanisms probably don't translate, but the underlying principle, controlled respiratory function under survival stress, might be worth investigating in a Voth context. I genuinely don't know. I'm a soldier, not a doctor. The senior authority said something. Neris turned slightly away, and Devlin thought, though he couldn't be certain, he didn't have the reference points, that she might be doing the Voth equivalent of hiding a reaction. The implant caught. He says that in 40 years of medicine, he has not been given a physiology lecture by a patient who should be dead. I'll take that as a compliment, Devlin said. Neris's nodes did the fast, complicated thing very rapidly for a brief moment, and then stopped. I need to ask about my unit, Devlin said. The 4 that are still unaccounted for in the rubble. I've been asking every day and I keep getting told the search is ongoing. What does ongoing mean? Do they have any biological readings? Do you have sensors that can detect human life signs through the debris? Because I have some familiarity with the collapse structure at Grid 7, echo from being inside it, and I can give you topographic information about the cavity system that might help locate them faster. A long pause. The senior authority and Neris looked at each other. The implant caught fragments of what passed between them, but not enough to assemble into sense. What Devlin could read, and he'd been studying the node language for 6 days now, and he was starting to develop a very rough vocabulary of it, was something that looked like uncertainty. The particular way the nodes flickered when someone was facing a situation that didn't match their available categories. Finally, the senior authority spoke to him directly. The implant gave him. One of the 4 was recovered yesterday. She is viable. The remaining 3, a long pause, the sensors are not detecting function. 3. But they might be wrong, Devlin said. The sensors are calibrated for Voth physiology, right? Not human. A human with severely suppressed vital signs, someone in deep trauma shock, or metabolic shutdown from blood loss might not register. I've seen it happen. Human bodies can run very slow when they have to. We have documented cases of people surviving situations where the external signs of life were undetectable. He was sitting up now, which his left side was going to penalize him for later. He didn't care. Put me in touch with the search team, or give me a Voth to human translation relay I can communicate through. I can help them understand what to look for. I can tell them about the structural voids I remember, the ones that were still stable when I was in there. If your sensors are giving false negatives because they're not calibrated for human biosigns, then you need someone who knows what to look for in human biosigns to go over the data. The senior authority was looking at him, with that shimmer in his nodes again. I understand that I'm not medically cleared for any of that, Devlin said. I'm not asking to physically go back in. I'm asking to look at your sensor data and your structural maps and give you additional information. From a bed, with an IV in my arm. He paused. Please. The last word came out quieter than the rest. Not quieter from weakness. He was past being ashamed of the desperation in it. The senior authority said something. The implant caught with unusual completeness. Bring him the data. It took another 4 hours to work out the translation relay necessary to make the sensor data comprehensible to him. And in those 4 hours Neris brought him 2 more warm fluid containers and changed the wound dressing once. And the Voth translator, a young one, Devlin thought, probably what passed for a junior specialist, sat on the low seat and worked with patient persistence to build him a key for the mapping software. The translator's name, or the portion of it the implant could render, was something like Vel. Vel had no strong feelings about whether the three remaining humans in the rubble at Grid 7, Echo, were alive or dead, as far as Devlin could read, but Vel was interested in the problem. Devlin watched curiosity move through the node patterns and recognized it because he'd been curious about those same nodes for 6 days. Whatever Vel was, Vel found puzzles engaging. Good, he could work with that. Okay, Devlin said, when the mapping software was adjusted enough for him to navigate. Walk me through the sensor methodology. Vel walked him through it. The sensors used biological resonance patterns, specific to Voth biology, which was why Devlin had suspected what he'd suspected. The signatures they flagged as viable corresponded to Voth metabolic rates, Voth cardiovascular output, Voth neural oscillation frequencies. Human metabolic rates can drop to about 15% of normal under severe hypothermia or trauma-induced shutdown, Devlin said. Cardiovascular output can drop proportionally. Neural oscillation is, he reached for the right language, harder to describe. But the point is that a human in deep shutdown looks a lot like a human who's dead by Voth sensor standards, especially given that human biosignatures look almost like static to Voth sensors anyway, from the briefing materials I've seen. Like static, Vel confirmed. Your species registers at a very low signal resolution on our equipment. So the 3 negatives might be 3 humans running very slow, breathing once every 40 or 50 seconds, heart rate in the low single digits, deep under debris that's insulating them from temperature fluctuation. He looked at the map. Or they might be dead, I know that. I'm not asking you to assume they're alive. I'm asking you to assume that your equipment might be wrong and look with different criteria. Vel said something the implant caught as, what different criteria? Heat differential, Devlin said. Even a very low metabolic rate produces some heat. In a debris field that's been sitting for 6 days, any anomalous heat source, even a very small one, should stand out against the ambient temperature. Can your sensors do thermal differential imaging at that resolution? Vel was quiet for a moment, then, yes. Run it over the areas I'm going to mark on the map. These 3 here. He indicated the structural voids he remembered, the spaces that had been stable, the places where the physics of the collapse had created pockets rather than flat compression. Start with the lowest temperature sensitivity your equipment can manage. Look for anything that's warmer than the surrounding debris by more than about a degree. Vel ran the scan. It took 11 minutes. Devlin lay as still as he could and watched the sealing membrane move and did not count the seconds because counting the seconds would not help anything. Vel looked at the results. Vel said something the implant caught very clearly. There are 2. He closed his eyes for a moment. 2, not 3, but 2. Where, he said. Vel showed him. Both of them were in one of the voids he'd marked, the one deepest in the collapse, the one where the largest overhead structure had come down at an angle and created a triangular cavity. Devlin had been in the outer portion of that cavity. He hadn't known anyone else was further in. They might not be alone, he said. If 2 are together, there could be a third they're sheltering. People in survival situations instinctively cluster. Body heat conservation, psychological. There could be 3 people in that cavity, 2 generating detectable signatures and 1 too far gone to register even with the thermal differential. Vel was very quiet. That is, the implant caught, a significant reinterpretation of the data. I know, send the search team to those coordinates. Tell them to look for a triangular cavity, approximately, he estimated from what he remembered of scale, approximately 4 meters on the long axis. Tell them to approach from the southeast, which is where the collapse is most stable. Tell them, he stopped. He was giving orders to people he didn't have authority over, in a situation where he was the patient, not the officer, which was not his normal operating mode and felt profoundly wrong in his nervous system. I mean, those are suggestions. Please tell them what you think is appropriate. Vel looked at him. You were a commander the implant caught before. I was a sergeant, Devlin said. I managed personnel, it's a habit. Vel sent the information to the search team. They found Corporal Enriquez at the 4-hour mark. They found Privates Whitmore and Jeek at the 6-hour mark, in the triangular cavity, sheltering a third person between them. Specialist Ajora Nwachukwu, 26 years old, 3 broken ribs and severe hypothermia, and a head wound that had bled more than it had damaged, who was alive because 2 of her colleagues had spent 6 days keeping her warm with their own bodies in the dark. Devlin got the news from Naris, who stood at the foot of his bed and spoke slowly enough for the implant to catch most of it, and whose nodes were doing something he had never seen before. All of them, both sides, pulsing in a long unified wave, rolling up from her chest to her jaw and back, over and over. Something deep and rhythmic that he thought, with no certainty but a significant instinct, was not a stress response or a confusion response or a clinical assessment response. He thought it might be what moved through the Voth when something had resolved that they hadn't expected to resolve. He lay back and looked at the membrane ceiling and did not cry, which was a decision he made consciously, and which lasted about 40 seconds before it stopped being a decision. Naris did not leave. She sat down on the low seat. She did not speak. The nodes kept their long, slow wave. He got himself back under control, the way he always got himself back under control. Slow breath out, count to 4, slow breath in, count to 4. He was aware, distantly, that he was doing the thing he described to her, the biomechanics of not coming apart. Thank you, he said when he could say it, for calling the senior authority, for getting me the data. She said something. The implant caught. You were correct that the sensors were insufficient. I got lucky, he said. I knew the space. If I hadn't been in that cavity, I wouldn't have known to look there. She said something else. The implant caught more of it this time. His ear was getting better at it, or maybe she was speaking more clearly, he wasn't certain which. You should not have been in a condition to remember the space. You should not have been in a condition to analyze sensor data. You should not. And then the implant dropped it. Yeah, he said, I know. She looked at him with those pale gold eyes. I'll tell you something else, he said. About the song, the one I was singing in the rubble. He looked at the ceiling. My mother, she died when I was 16. Car accident, very fast. And for a long time after that I didn't know what to do with the fact that she'd given me all these things, this particular kind of patience. The way she'd sit next to me and not try to fix things, just be there. The song. He exhaled. I didn't know what to do with the inheritance of someone who wasn't there anymore to inherit it from. He paused. I figured it out eventually. You use it. The things they gave you, you use them. That's what it means to carry someone forward. He looked at Naris. I think we might be built for carrying things forward. We're a species that buries our dead and then names our children after them. We write down everything that ever happened to us so someone else can read it later. We sing the same songs for 100 generations. He stopped. I don't know if that's what makes us survive things we shouldn't survive, but I think it's related. Naris was very still. Her nodes were still doing the long wave, but slower now, almost meditative. She said something. The implant gave him something he sat with for a long time afterward. Not the exact words, the implant never got exact words, but the shape of it, the meaning shadow, which was sometimes more true than the literal translation anyway. In the Voth asterisk it caught, when something continues beyond its expected function, we say it is asterisk, a word it couldn't render, which means approximately, still useful, still capable of purpose. We say this of old tools, old structures, old methods that outlast their predicted obsolescence. A pause. I do not think we have a word for what you are. Stubborn, he suggested. Her nodes did the fast, complicated thing for a brief moment. I'll take that as a laugh, he said. She didn't confirm or deny it, but she didn't move to leave either. On day 7, Vel brought him a grammar document. It was not a Voth to English grammar document. It was an English to Voth grammar document, a rough one, partial, built from the xenolinguistics files the station maintained on human languages for diplomatic purposes. The files were thin. The Voth had been maintaining formal contact with humans for just under 3 years, and the translation infrastructure had developed unevenly, fast in technical vocabulary and slow in everything else. Vel had supplemented the official files with notes, handwritten in Voth script, which Devlin couldn't read, but annotated with small, careful diagrams that served as a visual key. Vel sat on the low seat and walked him through the annotation system, and Devlin understood within about 10 minutes that this was Vel's hobby, not officially sanctioned, just something Vel had been doing. "You're building a better translation framework," Devlin said. Vel said something the implant caught as, "The current system loses approximately 60% of meaning in complex emotional registers. Technical language transfers well. Relational language does not." "That's the harder problem," Devlin said. "Relational languages, it's not just vocabulary, it's context. It's what you leave out. In English, we have an entire layer of meaning that lives in what's not said." He thought about it. "I imagine Voth has the same thing." Vel was quiet for a moment. "Then, the node language carries what speech does not." "Right, so when the implant catches the words, it's missing everything the nodes are doing at the same time. Consistently." "That's the gap," Devlin said. "That's the 60%. He looked at the grammar document. "What made you start working on this?" Vel said something the implant caught with some gaps, the collapse, the search. When you described the cavity structure, the way you remembered it, there was a quality to the information that the standard translation rendered as technical data. But the nodes of the search team commander, when he received it, indicated that he understood something beyond technical data. A pause. "I wanted to understand what the 60% contained." Devlin thought about that for a while. "There's a human concept," he said, "called the weight of words. The idea that the same sentence carries different weight depending on who says it and when and in what condition. When I described those cavities, I was describing them as someone who had been inside them, someone who had been afraid in them and then not afraid and then afraid again. The search commander's nodes," he paused, trying to reconstruct what he'd seen. "What were they doing when he received the information?" Vel described it. The implant lost most of the specifics, but the shape of it came through. Something urgent, something resolved, something that looked in the node language like the closing of an open question. "That's the weight," Devlin said. He understood that I wasn't giving him coordinates. I was giving him a map of a place I'd survived, which meant I believed the place was survivable, which meant, to someone who had been searching it as a location of death, that carried a different kind of authority than sensor data. He exhaled slowly. "That's what you're trying to capture." Vel looked at him with the particular Voth stillness that Devlin had come to understand, as a form of intense attention. "You understand language as a structure," the implant caught. "I grew up with a mother who was a librarian," Devlin said. "Before she died, she had opinions about language." He looked at the grammar document. "She would have loved this project." Vel seemed to receive that. The nodes did something brief and quiet. They worked on the grammar document for 2 hours. It was the most abstract conversation Devlin had had in years, more abstract than anything his military career usually required, and he found that some part of him had been hungry for it in a way he hadn't recognized until it was being fed. The shape of meaning. The architecture of what gets lost between minds of different kinds. Neris came to check his wound during the 2nd hour and stood at the edge of the conversation for a few minutes before leaving, and Devlin had the impression, without being able to articulate why, that she was pleased about something. On day 8, he asked Vel about the Voth custom around loss. Vel was quiet for a long time. "Why do you ask?" the implant caught finally. "Because Neris," he stopped. When I first told her about my mother, the song, she had a response I couldn't read. I've been thinking about it for 8 days and I still don't know what I saw in her nodes. He paused. I know I might be reading significance into something clinical. She might have just been processing a xenobiological data point. Vel said something the implant caught clearly. She was not. He waited. In the Voth, the implant caught slowly with care, and Devlin thought that Vel was choosing words with unusual deliberateness. When a person dies, we do not gap. We do not carry them in the way you have described. The Voth individual is understood to be a long gap * complete, finite. When the function ends, the record is archived. We do not sing their songs. That sounds. He stopped himself from finishing the sentence. It sounds what Vel said. I was going to say lonely, Devlin said, but I don't know if that's accurate. It might just be different. It is different, Vel confirmed, but something the implant lost. Neris has worked in medicine for 11 cycles. She has seen gap, a significant quantity of ending, and she has never had a patient describe the thing you described, using the inheritance of the dead to stay alive. A pause. It is not a concept the Voth have a word for. I didn't know it was a concept, Devlin said. It's just what you do. That, Vel said, is what interested her. He lay with that for the rest of the afternoon. Outside the membrane wall, the station moved through its amber rest cycle, and he listened to the sounds of it, the ventilation, the faint hum of systems, a distant conversation in Voth that the implant caught fragments of and assembled into nothing useful, and thought about what it meant to carry people forward, not as a philosophy, as a practice. The small daily acts of continuing to use what the dead had given you, speaking in rhythms your father taught you, making decisions the way your mentor would have made them, singing a song you learned in childhood without knowing where it came from, in the dark under 47 minutes of rubble, because a woman you lost at 16 had sat beside you and made the dark manageable and left you, forever, the method of it. He thought about the 12 Voth they'd found in the rubble. He thought about what it meant, in a culture that archived rather than carried, to give someone back. He still didn't have a word for what Neris had been doing when she froze at the foot of his bed on day 1 and looked at his wound and decided, against all her own data, that this would not end. But he thought maybe now he understood it better. She hadn't known about carrying forward. She'd only known about viable and non-viable, about what the data said and what the data predicted. And then she'd seen something in him that didn't fit the data, and she'd made a choice that her training had no framework for, and she'd spent 18 days. He would learn this only later, documenting every anomaly, every deviation from the predicted recovery curve, every time the numbers did something her models said they shouldn't, building a case in her own clinical language for the existence of something she couldn't yet name. The Voth didn't carry their dead forward, but Neris had started, without knowing it, to carry him. They cleared him for limited mobility on day 9. Limited mobility, in Voth medical terms, meant he could walk as far as the end of Level 9's main corridor with assistance. He walked it once in the morning and once in the afternoon, with Vel accompanying him on the grounds that Vel had become interested in the project of his recovery in a way that felt less clinical and more personal as the days went on, and Neris accompanying him on the grounds that she had simply started showing up at the times he walked, and no one had suggested she shouldn't. He walked slowly. His left side was still working on its accounting of what had happened to it, but he walked. On the 3rd day of limited mobility, they reached the end of the corridor, and he stood at the viewport for the first time. It looked out on the transit sector, the part of the station that had collapsed, or had collapsed. The Voth engineering crews had been working on it since the day after the accident, and from here, 9 days later, he could see that significant reconstruction was already complete. The Voth worked fast. They worked with that same unconscious competence he'd watched in Neris's hands, the same bored efficiency of people for whom the task was not new. How many people were in the collapse? He asked. He'd been asking piecemeal since he woke up and hadn't assembled the full picture. Vel told him. It was more than he'd thought. It was more than he'd wanted to think. He stood at the viewport for a while. The Voth who were lost, he said, were they from the station? Do they have people here who? Many had family aboard, Vel confirmed. Is there anything? He stopped. He was about to ask if there was anything he could do, which was a habit so ingrained that it came out before he'd thought it through, and the answer was obviously no. He was a human on day 9 of recovery from a non-survivable wound. He was not in a position to do anything. He didn't finish the sentence. Vel said something the implant caught. You have already done something. He looked at Vel. The search team found 12 Voth survivors from the rubble the implant caught, following the same method you described, thermal differential. The search had been concluded before your suggestion. It was reopened based on your analysis. A pause. 12. He stood with that for a moment. I didn't know they were still, he started. You suggested the methodology, Vel said simply. The search team applied it broadly. He looked at the reconstruction work through the viewport. The Voth crews moving in their efficient, unhurried way. On day 12, Enriquez came to see him. He was ambulatory, which the Voth medical staff seemed to find remarkable, though Devlin had a theory that Enriquez's recovery trajectory had confused their models almost as badly as his own had. Enriquez walked in, looked at the Voth medical bay with the expression of a man filing away every detail for a report he'd write later, and then looked at Devlin. You look terrible, Enriquez said. Day 12, Devlin said. You look great for day 12. I look terrible, Enriquez said. He pulled up the low seat. Ochoa sends her regards. She's on level 3. The others are, most of them are okay. Whitmore and Jeek are. His voice shifted slightly. They're asking about Nwachukwu. She's going to make it, Devlin said. I checked this morning. Enriquez exhaled. They sat in the particular silence of people who have come through something, and are not ready to talk about it directly. The Voth have been, Enriquez started and stopped. Yeah, Devlin said. I don't know what I expected. They're good at their jobs, Devlin said, and they're curious, more curious than I expected. Enriquez looked at the membrane ceiling. The senior medical authority came to see me, the tall one. He ran every scan he had on me, and then sat there for about 10 minutes, and then said something through the translator about documentation of resilient recovery function in human biology. He paused. I think he's writing a paper. Devlin laughed. It hurt. He did it anyway. There's going to be a formal inquiry about the collapse, Enriquez said. The Voth want a joint investigation. They want human representatives involved. Good, Devlin said. The diplomatic corps is going to want statements from all of us when we're cleared. I know. Enriquez looked at him. You know what they're saying on level 3 about why you're alive. Stubbornness, Devlin offered. Enriquez shook his head. They're saying Neris decided you were going to make it. That she put in more hours on your case than she's put into anything in 11 cycles. That she called in the senior authority, got you the sensor data, fought to keep the search active. He paused. They're saying she decided before you woke up, and then you just had the common sense to agree with her. Devlin thought about that. He thought about 12 minutes in the dark, singing a song. He thought about pale gold eyes and the slow node pulse, and a scanner being handed back to a medic with more care than authority. He thought about the way she'd looked at his wound, and the way the nodes had frozen, and the way something had moved through her expression that he'd spent 12 days trying to name and still couldn't quite. That sounds about right, he said. Enriquez nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then didn't. They sat in the silence again. Through the membrane wall, the sounds of the Voth medical station moved in their patterns, footsteps, equipment, voices in a language the implant couldn't fully catch but that had become, over 12 days, as familiar as any ambient sound. "When they clear us," Enriquez said eventually, "what do you think happens?" "Debrief, investigation, transfer. Back to Earth." "Probably," he thought about it, "eventually." Enriquez nodded. "I want to finish the investigation first," Devlin said. "The 12, the ones from the rubble, I want to make sure that's properly documented. What the thermal differential method found. Why it hadn't been used before. In case it's useful somewhere else, for someone else." Enriquez looked at him. "Carrying things forward," Devlin said, which probably didn't mean anything to Enriquez but meant everything to him. He was cleared for full mobility on day 18. The clearance was given by the senior medical authority, who had spent an additional 3 sessions with Devlin over the past week discussing, with the translation relay and Vel's patient assistance, the specifics of human wound response physiology, stress hormones, the mechanics of controlled respiration, and the phenomenon the senior authority had come to refer to, through the implant's best translation, as deliberate biological persistence. He had shown Devlin his notes. He had asked questions that were specific and careful, and that suggested he was building a model of something, constructing an understanding from pieces. Devlin had answered everything he knew how to answer. He told the truth about what he didn't know. He'd said, more than once, that he was a soldier, not a doctor, and the senior authority had responded more than once that the most useful data generally came from subjects rather than observers, which Devlin took as a compliment. On the morning of day 18, Neris brought him a container of warm fluid and didn't say anything for a while, and neither did he. They'd established this, over 18 days, a comfortable operational silence, the kind that happens between people who have been in close quarters long enough to stop needing to fill the space. "I'm going to be discharged today," he said. She said something, "The implant caught, I know. I'll probably be on this station for another several weeks, pending the investigation and the diplomatic process. So I'm not," he stopped. "I'm not going anywhere tomorrow." Her nodes did the slow wave. He'd come to understand that one. It was something like acknowledgement, like received. "I want you to know," he said, "that I'm going to make sure the thermal differential documentation goes into the joint medical records. I'm going to push for it to be integrated into search protocol, both sides. What Vel helped me figure out, that shouldn't be lost." "Vel has already submitted documentation," she said. "The implant caught it clearly. Vel was quite thorough." "Good," he paused. "Also, I want to ask you something. The song, the one I was singing when your medics found me. I've been trying for 18 days to figure out where it's from and I still don't know. My mother sang it to me but she never told me the origin and she's gone now so I can't ask her." He looked at his hands. "I was wondering if there was any chance your medics recorded the audio when they found me. I know it's a strange request, but I'd like to have it. The recording, if it exists." A long pause. She said something. "The implant caught most of it. When your medics found you, you were still singing. They recorded the extraction for documentation purposes. The audio is in your file." A pause. "I have listened to it." He looked at her. Her nodes were doing the thing he'd never been able to name, the one that had moved through her expression the first time she'd looked at his wound, all those days ago. He thought now, standing here on day 18 with 18 days of vocabulary and context and slowly assembled reference points, that he might finally have a word for it. It wasn't something the xenobiology briefings had prepared him for. It wasn't something that translated cleanly. But it was the Voth equivalent of the thing a person feels when they encounter something that shouldn't work and does, and can't fully account for it, and doesn't want to look away. Not confusion, not clinical interest. Something closer to wonder. "I'd like a copy," he said, "if that's permissible under your records protocols." She said something he didn't need the implant for. She said it with the shape of her hands and the angle of her head and the slow wave of her nodes. Yes, it meant, or something very close to it. He stood up, fully upright on day 18, left side reporting in at about a 3 on the 10-point scale. Not pain-free, not close to pain-free, but functional, operational. He picked up the container of warm fluid. "Thank you," he said, which he'd said enough times in 18 days that she probably understood it by now without the implant, for deciding I was going to make it. Her nodes shimmered, that particular shimmer he'd come to understand as what the Voth did instead of a smile, or as close as the node language got to it. He walked out of the medical bay under his own power. Behind him, the membrane ceiling moved in the ventilation, bioluminescent in the low light, and somewhere in the walls of level 9, in a station above a planet neither of them called home, a medical worker who had been practicing for 11 cycles stood at the foot of an empty bed and found that her understanding of survivable had been revised, permanently, in a direction she hadn't expected. That, too, was a form of persistence. The records would show that on the day of his discharge, Sergeant First Class Marcus Devlin had a resting heart rate of 58 beats per minute, functional mobility across all tested parameters, wound closure at approximately 73%, and projected full recovery within an additional 40 days. The records would not show the song, but Neris had a copy, and she had listened to it 11 times by the morning of day 18. And she would listen to it more times than that before the year was done, and she would not be able to explain, to anyone who asked, why a piece of sound carried through rubble by a human who should not have been alive had become the thing she played quietly in the early amber of the rest cycle, when the station was slow, and she was alone with whatever moved through her nodes in the dark. What she would be able to explain to the senior medical authority, to Vel, to the 3 colleagues who asked over the following months, was the clinical record, the documentation she'd been building since day 1, entry by entry, the way a careful scientist builds a case from accumulating anomalies. It was, her colleagues would agree, a remarkable document. It became the first comprehensive cross-species comparison of wound response variation under survival stress conditions, co-authored with the senior authority and translated by Vel using the improved framework, and it was eventually distributed through the Voth Medical Network in a form that reached several hundred practitioners across 11 stations. The section on respiratory self-regulation under survival conditions was considered particularly significant. It included a notation, in careful Voth medical language, that the mechanism had first been observed not in a laboratory context, but in 47 minutes of active emergency, reported by a human subject who had learned the technique not from training but from a woman who sang to him when he was sick, and who was gone now, and who had given him the tool without knowing what it was. The notation did not include the word for it. There was not yet a word for it. Vel was working on one. Devlin would not know about the paper for several months. When he did find out, through a joint diplomatic communication that referenced it obliquely in a footnote, he sat with the information for a while before he did anything else. He was in a different place by then. Back with the 14th, back in the rhythms of the work, the daily texture of operational life that had always been better at filling time than filling the quieter spaces. He thought about his mother. He thought about the archive and the carrying forward, and the difference between them. He thought about 12 Voth pulled from rubble by a search method that shouldn't have worked by the data, and about Enriquez walking into the medical bay on day 12 looking terrible and alive, and about Whitmore and Jeek in the dark of a triangular cavity, for 6 days keeping a woman warm between them because they'd decided she was not going to die on their watch. He thought about Neris standing at the foot of an empty bed. He wrote her a message through the joint diplomatic communication relay. It took 3 drafts. The translation relay still lost about 40% of the relational layer, but Vel had submitted an updated protocol to the relay administrators that was scheduled for integration, and even at 60% there was enough. He wrote, "I found out where the song is from." He wrote, "It's from an old film, a very old one before my country had the borders it has now. The composer died decades ago. No one left who knew her. The song existed for a while without anyone to carry it, and then my mother found it somewhere and learned it, and then she was gone too, and then it was just me." He wrote, "I think that might be the most human thing I know how to tell you. Things that should be finished, continuing anyway." He wrote, "Thank you for not finishing me." He sent it before he could edit it further. He didn't know, and would not know for several more weeks when her reply arrived through the same relay, that she had read it 17 times before responding. He didn't know that she had shown it to Vel, who had used sections of it in the updated translation framework documentation as primary source examples of the relational register. He didn't know that the senior authority who had reviewed Vel's documentation had made a note in his own records that read, in the Voth equivalent of medical shorthand, something that translated roughly as, "Subject demonstrates continued non-viable function. See file. Recommend ongoing study." What he knew was that he had survived, that others had survived, that something had been built in the space between two species trying to understand each other with inadequate tools and considerable determination, and that whatever it was now in the record, permanent, the way things become permanent when someone decides they're worth carrying. He had his mother's song in an audio file on his personal drive. He played it sometimes, in the early hours when the bass was quiet. He was not sure what he believed about where the dead went, or whether they went anywhere, or whether the question even had a shape that language could hold. He was sure that when he played the song he felt something that was heavier than memory and lighter than grief, and that the word for it in English was also not quite right, and that maybe the right word was in a language he didn't speak, or maybe it was in the 60% that the implant lost, or maybe it was the thing Vel was still working on naming. Something that continues beyond its predicted obsolescence. Something still capable of purpose. Some things, it turned out, did not need a medical explanation. Some things just needed to be carried forward.